Hello War of the Visions fans, I'm Jackie Fox. Thanks for tuning in to another episode. Today we're going to be continuing a three-part series on team building, or so far it's 3 parts, maybe I'll add a fourth. In the first, we talked about the 3 major win cons in this game, or the 3 major strategies for pursuing them. You either aim to take your opponent out as quickly as possible, eliminating some of their setup and some of their defenses from the equation, while trying to do as much damage as quickly as possible. This is called rush. We also had sustain, which is basically the opposite. You're trying to outlast your opponent and bring them into a point of the game where they have just atrophied and you can beat them down. And then there's economy teams, which tend to win maybe more in the mid to late game, a little bit earlier than sustain teams because they aren't as inherently defensive, but they are playing games with the way that you accumulate resources within a fight, which are going to give them an advantage, which does kind of bear offensive and defensive boons. So it's kind of like a mixed team, but it's not. You can't just mix sustain and rush and expect a team to work. You really have to play through economy. In the second video, we talked about a number of niches and strategies that more specifically describe the teams that you want to use, like a team with ranged units that take advantage of their long range to take characters out before they get to them. Teams like this naturally line up quite well with rush. And because gunners just have a lot of trouble staying on the board once they're being targeted, this really doesn't have a strong synergy with sustain. So you figure out your win con, and that's going to help you decide what niche you want to play. But who you want to beat is also really going to be a determining factor of what niche you're going to play, because certain niches are better at beating certain opponents than others. If your opponent doesn't have a lot of accuracy, for instance, if they're kind of blind, then it might be a lot easier to run an evasion team into them. In today's video, we're going to be talking about something, at least within Final Fantasy, that is almost unique to this game, or at least this game and maybe Final Fantasy Tactics, and that's placement. And while unit placement seems like a really simple thing, it is, in my experience of playing this game for the last couple of years, the factor that really separates good players from new players. And, mastering this will take your skills hopefully beyond that newbie level. And hopefully this is going to be my best video for explaining how to do this, because this is something I've been an advocate for people learning about for a while. And in this video, I'm going to try to give you my most map general advice. Advice is going to work on most maps. It is important to keep in mind that sometimes only 2 units can get to each other on these maps. One of them will kind of be sectioned off, and that's going to screw with some of these formations and strategies. But most of the time, all 3 units can get to each other, and that's kind of the condition that I'm thinking about for this video. But this video is also going to think about some grand arena stuff as well. And to talk about that, first, we're going to have to talk about affinity. For people who've been playing this game for maybe 2 or more years, you probably are already familiar with affinity, because it used to be a thing that you actually had to farm for each character as you got them. But now, all characters have max affinity with each other at all times, unless you turn that feature off. So what does affinity do? Well, I looked this up because I wanted to have the exact numbers, and I found this really unfortunate wotv support post, which is kind of the epitome of an issue that I have with this game. I mean, yes, the post is tremendously vague for something that is kind of the backbone of the way that this game plays out in PvP and in PvE, honestly, but mainly in PvP. But also, for whatever reason, this user has been permanently deleted from the site. And in addition to that, a lot of this post is outdated. So if you want the real information on how affinity works, maybe it's best to go to Reddit. Now, unfortunately, this post by Philosoph from 4 years ago is also outdated because the UI change that I talked about, which honestly made the game so much, it was very grindy in order to get affinity. but it's a really important thing to understand. So let's go through this as quickly as we can. At max rank, Affinity provides a boost of 10% agility, 15% dexterity, and 10% luck to units that are within 2 spaces of each other. It partially stacks, so units in a tight-knit formation leverage this best, more than a scattered group of lone wolves. But having at least one nearby ally is always a good idea, because there is going to be diminishing returns to the stacking. And that's going to drop off completely after the first 3 units are near you. So in Grand Arena, there are situations where you might have 5 characters near one another, and at least one of those characters isn't receiving a bonus from one of them. But you got to think, especially if you spread this formation out to make it a little bit more AoE resistant, then it really becomes interesting even with that. Because if you spread your units out right, most of them won't have that 5th unit or 4th unit near them. Only the unit in the center will. Which also means that the unit in the center will still be at full power even if you lose whichever unit is facing the enemy, which can add some resiliency. Now on the current map, it's hard to get all 5 of your units together, but I have seen teams that reliably get 4 units together, which again maxes your bonuses. And I have been able to do that pretty reliably for myself by thinking about who moves first and how I get them to move closer to the bulk of my units instead of moving further away. And questions like that are kind of going to be what we're examining here in this video and with these formations. Now it's worth pointing out here that luck, dexterity, and agility, I think, all affect multiple things as stats. So agility is going to make you more evasive. So is more luck. Luck and agility are both going to make you more evasive when you're near your friends. So evasion teams are potentially the most evasive when they're near each other, actually. Dexterity is going to raise your critical rate. I think luck and dexterity might raise your accuracy. These things are going to raise your damage. It's going to raise the speed at which you accumulate CTs, so you're going to take turns faster. And all of these things are especially beneficial for rush and economy teams because they're helping with your CT economy, they're helping with your damage, they're helping you put pressure on your enemy. And this all comes at the trade-off that the AI is more likely to put you in a vulnerable situation where your units are grouped up together and you are more vulnerable to AoE attacks. And at times when AoE has been super dominant in the meta, people have actually felt as though they benefited from having less affinity. Because affinity, since the AI is trying to do the most damage it can with its attacks, especially when it's not AoE attacking, this can lead to a tendency where it wants to get one of your characters within affinity range of your other units so that it can do slightly more damage in battle, which is going to cause your units to inherently clump up a lot more than they would if you have this feature turned off. So you lose a lot of stats. You lose damage, evasion, accuracy, all sorts of things by turning this off. But strategically, your units won't clump up together because they won't be trying to take advantage of the system, and that could offer some defensive bonuses. I'm not saying that sustained teams should consistently run with their affinity off. I'm just saying that I think that that's really the only type of team where the advantages could outweigh the losses for turning the affinity system off. This is also going to mean that on most maps, the character in the middle of your formation is going to be receiving affinity from 2 units, whereas the ones in slot 1 or slot 3 are only going to be receiving affinity from the unit in the middle, which means that the unit in the middle is going to be slightly faster than it seems like they should be, because they're getting a 20% agility bonus at the beginning of the fight, where the other characters are only, or not 20%, but close to it, while the other characters are only getting about 10%. So with all that being said, let's look at some formations and how they can benefit you in battle. Okay, so getting into the placement strategies I like to use, let's start with the Triforce of Choice. In initial placement, the easiest formation is a simple triangle with one space in the center. If you want a longer buff rotation, then place your fastest unit at the front of the party. This will trigger them, acting first, to run backwards and buff the other two, which also means that you want the fastest unit on this team to have the most consequential buff. This is a really good place for Sodley because he's such a fast character anyways. Having him run back and buff your party with Maneater and HP Drain is just super powerful, and this is kind of perfect for him. Another way of doing a similar thing is the slow center strategy. You put your slowest unit in the middle on a more regular spread. In a case where you can't change the initial placement, you can only change which character is in which slot. You reserve slot 2 for your slowest character. This often lines up pretty well with that character being your tank. And for a tank, this can also be great because even though they're going to be moving last, they're going to be the character that's moving towards the enemy first, because the first turns of the characters in slot 1 and slot 3 are going to be to run to them in the center and buff them. So they're going to be getting a lot of buffs on them, but much like the Triforce of Choice, this character in the center is also the character that you want to have your most consequential buff on. Now, this can be a rough formation. This can be a more difficult formation for Sodley because he is so fast, and it can be difficult to get characters on 1 and 3 faster enough than him that not only are they faster than him when they go into the fight, but they're also faster than him when you add in the fact that he is going to have a bit of additional affinity on those two. So even when you think you can do this, sometimes you can't. Sodley will still move before one or both of them because of affinity. But if you can get him or another character like that to move last on your team, then the other two units will basically position themselves to be buddy buffed by this character, which is pretty great. If you can get your second fastest character to have a larger AoE on their buff, then they'll be able to move in range to buff not just one, not just the character in the center, but both of the other characters with their initial buff. So now let's talk about misdirection. This can be a really powerful strategy for throwing your opponents off, and sometimes when other things aren't working, this will do it. In auto, placing a tank with initial hate on the far side of the map, being either slot 1 or slot 3, can draw opponents into unfavorable and unexpected positions, potentially allowing your other units to flank them from the other side of the field, or just throw their buffs off in a way that makes their team perform most suboptimally. Like, this just really screws with what people come to expect from their opening out of their team. I mean, if you're putting all this effort into setting up your opening buff so that they do a specific thing, and then a character on the other side of the field causes them to do something completely different, well, that's going to upset your chances to win. So this can be a disruptive pattern, essentially. Then we have one that is common sometimes. It's not my favorite, but when it works, and it's called leapfrog. This is going to require you to cascade your characters, which is going to mean that you need to arrange them fastest to slowest. Fastest and slowest can either be on 1 or 3, but the middle character needs to be in the middle of the map. They could also potentially have a very similar speed to the slowest character and just use that extra affinity to push them over the top. But you want, let's say your fastest character is in slot 1. Slot 1 will run to buff slot 2. Slot 2 will then run to buff slot 3. And then slot 3 will buff slot 2 and run forward themselves. So, like the slow center strategy, with leapfrog, you're only going to have one of your 3 characters moving forward towards the enemy, and it's only going to be your slowest character. So in a lot of ways this plays out the same. I would say the buffs aren't nearly as optimal though, But what this does that slow center will never be able to do, and why it might be better in certain cases, is it allows you to start your offense on a far side of the map, which kind of can combine some of the factors of the slow center start, getting your tank out forward before everybody else, while also combining some aspects of misdirection. Because if that tank is also running up one side of the field, and they have initial hate, or at this point they've been able to apply hate to themselves with their buffs, then this is really going to throw your opponents off. This might even be a way to do a misdirection type strategy that kicks in a little bit later without having a tank that has initial hate. So this isn't as much about positioning, and the rest of these strategies aren't as much about positioning, at least where you put your characters at the beginning of the game, but this is more about positioning into the game. Mixed range teams, using a close range or high movement unit with a long range, low movement unit, consider like Elia Rundle with Snow or Katone, allows one unit to draw the focus in the mid to rear field, while range units can support and follow up attacks with damage. The forward unit must be able to endure and, if possible, also help on damage. This one seems to be making a comeback strategically with like Riku and Yuna specifically. But there are other teams that can benefit this sort of strategy. One of the better teams ever to do this historically was actually Elia Rundle, Eliza as an archer, and Snow. Because Snow was durable, he could do decent damage, so he could help these ladies take somebody out, but he was tanky enough and had enough tricks up his sleeve that he would survive long enough that he would allow Elia and Eliza to wipe people out before they even thought about getting near them to hit them, which is pretty good. Pretty good strategy. Hate is love? If possible, units in slot 2 will typically buff slot 1 because of the one initial hate that slot 1 provides. This isn't strong enough to warp the opponent's movements like it does in misdirection, but it is a tiebreaker for friendly buffs if no one has initial hate. Worth keeping in mind. Good stuff. This I probably should have thrown into the niches for the last team. Use your newest units. It can be hard to make these teams work because of a typical lack of synergy, either between element or job. But Dark and Universal VCs can help these compositions come together a lot, and if you want, I've made an entire video on those type of cards and which ones you should be prioritizing, which ones you're going to want to use on like every one of these teams if you can't find other synergies and other ways of getting some of these stats on there. And then finally, this one's been popular recently, and it's just a really interesting combo that the pieces have been here since Bart's to be able to do this, but it's only just now becoming a thing where enough characters in the meta have these abilities that we're really seeing this used more and more often these days. But it's called the 3-hit combo. Use 1 to 2 units of the follow-up hit attack, and 1 to 2 units that can follow up other people's attacks. Classic example here, and a team that has been doing a lot since it came out. But Gilgamesh and Shurika as a partnership. Because Shurika follows up her own attacks, Gilgamesh follows up other people's attacks. If Shurika attacks from beside Gilgamesh, she can deal enough damage to bring somebody down to low health, maybe triggering their courage if they have it. Then her follow-up hit will take their courage out, and then let's say they also have re-raise. This is maybe the best scenario for them defensively. I mean, except imagining that they don't go to courage on the first hit, but that's another issue. Even if they have re-raise at this point, because Gilgamesh is also going to follow this up, it could take down someone who has a chunk of HP remaining, as well as having re-raise and courage active, without actually having to dispel either of those things. Like, just brute force damaging your way through it. These types of teams are super rushy, but you also want to consider that Gilgamesh, this is a team that absolutely benefits from Affinity being on, because you want units to kind of bunch up with Gilgamesh. Because if they're in Affinity range for Gilgamesh, then they're in Seeking Plume range for Gilgamesh. So you want your characters to be near him when they're launching their attacks. Because of that, this maybe isn't unique in being the only strategy that is handicapped by turning Affinity off. But I think it's probably the one that is the most handicapped by turning Affinity off. Because this combo, which is kind of what you put these characters together to do, is only really going to work if they're standing near each other, because of the way that Seeking Plume works. So this is absolutely a strategy that wants you to keep your Affinity on. And with all that being said, I hope you understand the game a lot better now, and I hope you have enough of this like battle theory in your head that if I run into you in arena, that you'll put up a pretty good fight. Like, there's so many people out there who could step up their game, who have a lot of other things going for their teams, but then I observe them getting placement wrong. Like, for instance, a really good example of how important placement can be is imagining two teams that have roughly similar speeds going into a format where initial placement is possible. Say I use initial placement to set the Triforce of Choice, meaning that all three of my characters have almost full affinity bonuses at the very beginning of the fight. The other team has a more spread out normal opening start, because this is the map default. I'm almost always going to be faster than that team. And not only am I going to be faster than that team, my whole team is going to be faster than that team in a lot of cases. Just because of the affinity bonuses and how strong they can be right at the beginning. Now my team may move a little bit further away from each other after their first couple of buffs, and they may lose a little bit of affinity with each other as they move out onto the field, whereas the other team may gain affinity as it moves closer together to buff. But I definitely have a big speed boost at the very beginning of the game, and I'm absolutely going to get through my opening buff pattern a lot faster, and that's usually an advantage. So just straight up, if you change nothing else between two fights like this, that is going to be a pretty significant advantage. With all that being said, thank you so much for watching. You can support the channel on Patreon or Ko-fi. You can also support the channel by buying my books on Amazon. Look for Jackie Fox and brightly colored fiction titles. Also, definitely, if you don't have the mind to do those things, if Christmas has really wiped you out, then you can always like and subscribe. Be sure to ring the bell, because sometimes I say controversial words like missile or gunner because of the way that this game works. And it can be really helpful in terms of my channel stability for you to ring the bell so you always see the videos instead of just when I don't talk about missile units. But with all that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.